Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Welcome once again to another episode of the Pompey Politics Podcast. If you are watching along, then hopefully you're marvelling at the new camera technology that is keeping my head in the centre of the screen, having frustrated Simon for years with my wobbly head approach to broadcasting. If you're listening live, or listening on the podcast, you're not going to get it. But trust me, I'm told it looks good.
It looks good, but now that you've cursed it, it's probably bound to fall over completely.
And talking of giant orbs that might have an influence over things, we're covering the Tuesday's full council, and usually these episodes are, shall we say, more aimed at the aficionado that likes the more complex parts of due process. But it all got a bit spicy on Tuesday, didn't it? And I went back and looked, and evidently it was a full moon on Tuesday, and possibly that had an effect.
Maybe if we had a council chamber full of lycanthropes, were councillors? I don't know. But we knew where they were. Sorry, that's
nope.
it. I'm not trying anymore.
You should steer clear of that one.
We should press on. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot to cover, and there were some big issues. So let's kind of dive straight in. One of the first things that they did was agree to take actually the motion, the notice of motion, which was 9F, actually first, because someone needed to leave the chamber early. So we got kind of straight into that. One of the things to watch out for, there's a bit of a revelation which you might have heard about in the evening news, which we'll cover in a bit, and also the comparison between how many members' questions there were this month compared to last month, when there were 16. So
shall we get into the sensible stuff first before all hell broke loose?
Yeah, let's try and lull our audience into a false sense of security and show them the calm stuff first. So motion F, which was the support for repair cafes, Portsmouth. There was a great deputation from Claire Seek, who runs the Repair Cafe and Library of Things. It's a real issue for the UK. She's talking about electronic waste, the UK being the second biggest producer of e-waste per person, and only 22% of that waste is recycled. So she was calling on, the motion was calling on supporting policies that promote repair rather than straight to recycle. She talked about the Library of Things, which is also something that she runs, where over 1,000 things have been borrowed by members, saving them about £80,000. So you can just borrow things rather than paying for something that actually you would use quite infrequently, which was really good. But the motion essentially calls for recognition of the dedication of the work of staff and volunteers who set up these facilities, continue the aim to reduce carbon, waste raw material use by sharing, repairing and reusing items, and the Repair Cafe allows users to share their skills with other people, which is a great thing. Library of Things allows people to loan items infrequently used and save money. But the motion just calls for the leader to sign the UK Repair and Reuse Declaration, which calls on the government to make repair more affordable with things like tax reductions and repair vouchers. Some of the discussion that took place in the chamber, as well as the recognition of Claire's work, was the acknowledgement that actually quite often it's cheaper to just buy a new one than it is actually to buy a part to replace your washing machine, for example. There were some examples then. Judith Smythe also made an intervention offering her services to repair clothes. So if anybody needed to repair those, again, that's a fashion waste is a big thing. And the motion also called on introducing a repair index. So if you think when you buy electrical items now, they have an energy efficiency rating. But what they have in France is something called a repair index. So you can understand how easy that is to repair. And to introduce targets to reuse and repair ahead of recycling and support a new generation of repairers with training. which these all sound like great
Absolutely.
ideas. And you would be unsurprised to know that passed unanimously.
Yeah, no. So I mean, fantastic, isn't it? The work of the Repair Cafe, and I think it is it's always a balancing act. When like with you mentioned washing machines and white goods, there is a presumption that how long have we had it? Or by the time I've called somebody out and they've told me it needs a new motor, I'll just order one from the internet, get them to take the other one away. So no, great work, and good to see that one moved on quickly.
Indeed, and then we reverted to normal running order. So we went to motion A, and let me just kind of switch that around a bit so that we've got that on screen. So item A was about the definition of sexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. We had a deputation from Steph Richards, which was calling on Portsmouth City Councils to look at basically their statements and policies that define those forms of phobia and discrimination, and calling for every member of the community to feel safe, valued, and protected. And this would be a step forward in creating an inclusive and equal community. And she also mentioned that she'd welcome any amendments seeking to also address racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. So the Labour motion, which was from Mary Vallely and Charlotte Gerarda, noted that there's been a 462% increase in sexual orientation hate crime, a 1,426% increase in transgender hate crime between 2012 and 2023, and to add definitions to PCC's websites for sexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. There was a Lib Dem amendment from Steve Pitt and Darren Sanders to tighten up some of the language in the motion and to specify that Portsmouth City Council recognises the UN's fair and equal definitions. So these aren't just things that the council has just kind of made up. And that's to be fair, that was what was referred to in the original motion. And for GASC, for the Governance Audit and Standards Committee, to consider recommending these definitions and review similar content on Portsmouth City Council's website. The amendment was well received, and the proposers agreed to subsume that. And although there was a bit of a pause while that was distributed, but the amended motion or the subsumed motion was unanimously accepted by the council.
Yeah, another slightly odd one. This one, I again, important topic. There are definitions out there, and glad to see the UN ones have been adopted by the administration. So hooray, cheer, move on.
Indeed. So shall we go for next? We were going to go for no. Sorry, I've lost my way a little bit. It was we're going to jump to the end and go for G. Go for Hope Value, compulsory purchase order, Hope Value sites. So this was a Lib Dem motion that was brought by councillors Hunt and Adair. And this one calls for basically it calls for the officers to create a report and give that to the portfolio holder for planning policy and city development on Hope Value sites. Now, to give a bit of explanation, the Hope Value sites are sites where developers perhaps haven't actually proceeded with developing them because they're hoping they can make more profit off them later on. By some other further thing that happens, so that essentially they kind of leave them in a bad state or run down or completely derelict. And there being several sites, they listed some in the conversation about it around the city. And the motion talks about rents being over £1,000 a month for a 3-bedroom property, sites left in a derelict state by developers. And it talks about the current compulsory purchase order regulations talks about that actually remuneration being at market value, as if the developer had actually agreed to sell willingly, but it also allows for the inclusion of Hope Value. So the proposal being that if you've got a derelict site, it's worth a certain amount, but if in the future planning permission gets awarded for it, then it's actually worth more, even as a derelict site, because there's planning consent, and that's what the hope value is kind of talking about. And the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act of 2023 allows that hope value to be removed. So Councillor Corkery asked about, didn't we actually have an eyesore group that looked at this before? George Fielding from the Labour group talked about land banking, not maintaining properties. It's a real problem, so this is to be welcomed. And Councillor Hugh Mason talked about we mustn't use industrial land and we must prevent the eyesores and reduce the number of HMOs and their impact. Councillor Leader Steve Pitt confirmed that there used to be an eyesores group, but before the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, they didn't really have any powers. It kind of went around in circles a lot, but he also cited the example of the Debenhams development, where that seemed to be stalled for quite a while, but essentially telling the owner that basically the council was going to compulsory purchase order it. Somehow, suddenly, a new developer came forward with a plan that the council could work with. So it does seem to work.
Yeah, again, one's a bit of a head scratcher. The Lib Dems seem to be calling on the Lib Dems to give a report to the Lib Dems for them to do some stuff. I'm not quite sure, the council officers to give a report to the Lib Dems so that they can do some stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the challenge, isn't it? You know, property developers, the clue's in the name. They buy these things to develop them, not just out of altruism, but to attempt to make vast profits. That's their objective. So, you know, whilst it is appropriate that wherever possible, you can intervene to try and get these things moved on. Yeah, this one just seems a little bit processy to me, and I'm not sure what value it was adding.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some sort of angle to it that we're missing, but I don't know how that wasn't just a memo that was sent. By the way, could you create a report for this? So unless there's some kind of key political revelation that's going to come from that, or some massively influential political campaign that's going to come from it, I don't quite understand. But it seems that the evidence is there of what can work with some developers. So if the powers are there, it seems like the council should get on and use them, really.
Happy with that one.
Okay, so do we want to look at temporary housing crisis, or do we get straight into social media policy?
Let's get into the you know, the starter was there, but this is the main course we've been looking forward to, isn't it?
So the social media policy. I'll just do a quick lead in, and then I'll play a clip. This was a motion basically coming from the Labour group, and Charlotte Gerarda introduces it in the clip, so I'll let her introduce that. There's also amendments from both the Portsmouth Independence Party, which essentially calls for an independent panel of residents, not linked to a political party, to review that and then give that to GASC, and then for GASC to feed that back to the council. And it cites the case law of Ken Livingstone, where he was basically an attempt to pursue him for conduct when he was actually the Lord Mayor of London, but it was at an event where he went at a time where he couldn't reasonably be expected to have been acting as the Lord Mayor, even though he was still obviously the Lord Mayor. So that the courts found in his favour that actually he wasn't bringing the city into dispute. There was also a Lib Dem amendment that tidies up the language and makes it clearer, and to remove working party group from the motion. And there's some stuff in the clips that can kind of speak to that. So shall I go forth?
Let's hear where the story began.
Okay, let's do this one.
Councillor Gerarda.
Many councillors, like other elected officials, choose to use social media to keep residents updated on their work, to share information about campaigns, and to engage residents in democratic processes like elections. And many residents use social media to raise issues, ideas, and concerns. While social media has been a largely positive tool for me in my councillor role, it has also sadly been a real source of anguish and frustration. As some of you may know, I have been targeted by an individual for months, where he's been posting multiple times on various Facebook groups about me with untruths, often in public forums on Facebook groups and with content that has actually been shared directly with fascist organisations. And I know of other colleagues that have been harassed by this individual online too, and it's caused untold misery when it does flare up. Similarly, when residents have raised concerns with me about the content posted online about councillors, there isn't a clear policy for them to hold us to account. So what we found that it is common practice for local authorities' code of conduct for members to include content about the proper use of social media or to adopt a separate social media policy. The Portsmouth City Council Code of Conduct for members has no reference at all to social media use and has no separate social media policy for members. We are civic leaders within our communities. Many of us are followed by hundreds, if not thousands of people, and they carefully consider our words and what we post. That's why we're asking for a cross-party working group to be established to review the Portsmouth City Council Members' Code of Conduct with a view to strengthening it. So to include reference to conduct on social media, or like other councils, to establish a separate social media policy for members. We're also asking that in order to encourage all elected councillors to use social media responsibly, in line with best practice from the LGA, that the council should share the LGA's guide to the role for councillors on social media with all current elected members of Portsmouth City Council. And lastly, we're asking for the council to explore social media training for members and share any opportunities with elected councillors.
Councillor Steve Pitt.
There is already a framework to do this piece of work, and if council is minded to support it, then the proper way to do that is to simply refer it to the Governance Audit and Standards Committee, which is capable of setting up a working party, should it wish to, carry out a review of this and then bring it back through the normal processes. I just don't feel that adding another layer of anything, whether it's a resident committee or a cross-party group leaders committee, is actually going to add any value here when we already have the correct framework and mechanism within our constitution to deal with the issue. So that's literally all this amendment does, apart from it does replace the word explore with reinforce, and that's because we do already have member social media training. Members may remember at the last council meeting, I pointed out that at the last opportunity to do that training, only one person did. So the issue may be less with the training and more to do with the lack of engagement with the training, but that might be something that gets picked up through the review at governance and audit. Thank you.
Councillor Hunt.
You know, I'm really cautious when we try to stifle or control what members want to say. That does cause me concern, but I do think that it's important that councillors should be free to say what they say. We don't always agree with things that other members say. Quite a bit. I don't agree with what Councillor Madrick says sometimes, but he represents a group or a cohort of people that have a firm view, and I wouldn't wish to control his views.
Councillor Bosher.
I have a council Facebook group, a Facebook page, where that's where all my political activities are. But I have a personal Facebook page, which is largely down to my family and friends and a lot of other sorts of things. At what point am I regarded as being a councillor or not a councillor? Now, I don't necessarily agree with what some Labour councillors actually put on their Facebook pages. I don't necessarily agree with everything that Councillor Madrick puts up in his particular thing. But you all have a solemn right to actually do that. But I am concerned that we could be going down the line, if we are not careful, of controlling what elected members can and can't say on social media. And I think if we go too far down that particular rabbit hole, we are going to find ourselves in a world of problems if we're not careful.
You, Councillor Barrett.
So I do understand why you have those concerns. I mean, my son sat up there in the chamber. He's unfortunately been at the end of some rather abusive comments when I've been in the street, particularly recently with things going on social media. It's not pleasant to have your child shouted and screamed at, being called a race traitor when you're walking down the road. It's that kind of stuff. So I can understand the concerns, why this has been brought here. But I don't know how we can go forward with this, because obviously people want a clear distinction. I don't know how we can do that. Members of the public don't see us as, you know, councillor for a certain amount of time during the day. They just see us, they've elected us, they know they've gone out and voted for us, they've elected us. They expect us to do this role whenever they need us to do this role, and there's not this clear-cut time that, no, I'm not a councillor now, I'm an individual. So, and that's why people get so upset, I think, sometimes.
Councillor George Madgwick.
I think Labour want to control open dialogue and make it hard to allow debates and free speech on social media. And I think we all know that this motion's on the paperwork. Let's not kid around here, because I have an interest in social media presence where I openly speak my mind and I wear my heart on my sleeve. And sometimes you disagree with it, sometimes you don't, but that's your right. But, you know, I can say what I kind of want and feel, and then it's up to my residents to judge whether that's acceptable or not and to re-elect me. Now, I think it's interesting because obviously in the references that you provided, it does reference social media policies and WhatsApp groups and Facebook pages and all this kind of stuff. And it does, you're correct, have a reference from LGA who say admins of groups on social media are legally responsible for the content within that group. If an admin fails to moderate content, they may be defined as breaching code of conduct in local government and could be held for libel or defamation. And obviously, Charlotte Gerrard said there at the start that people should think before we speak. And Mary said in her speech, words hurt, words matters. Is that correct? Perfect, because the other day we were handed 500 screenshots of a WhatsApp group that the Labour Party hold. And in these conversations, which I believe have been given to the news as well.
So just before George launches in there, I think it's probably because there's quite a lot there to start with, I think, because and again, we both have a social media presence. You're an admin on Portsmouth Politics. I am a former admin and occasional black sheep on Portsmouth Politics. I'm sent often to the naughty step for crossing a line, so I am not sitting here from a position of holier than thou. But it does mean that we are also aware of some of the things that Charlotte referenced. So she referenced an individual who has been posting about her on social media. Both of us know who that individual is. And the abuse that Charlotte gets is absolutely beyond the pale. And, the little that I've seen is completely unacceptable. And I think we have to start from that position because, that kind of personal attack, that kind of abuse of our elected officials is absolutely, is just wrong. We don't need, there's no ambiguity there. I think the bit where I then start to struggle is the pivot from that into the behaviour of councillors. Because I'm not aware of any councillor from any party that has stalked or abused a fellow councillor in the way that Charlotte was describing the abuse she receives from an individual who we will not name.
No, I think so. I think there's kind of two streams to that, isn't there? And actually, that's the language that she uses in her summing up in a second. Is that one stream is how so that councillors can understand what support there is for them and how to conduct themselves when they're on the end of unacceptable or bad behaviour, actually online, in the same way as hopefully there's support for them if they ever, God forbid, find themselves on the end of unacceptable, wrong, threatening, etc. behaviour in person. But the other angle is how the councillors conduct themselves, and I think what Councillor Madgwick is hinting at here is some of the and again I'm supposing because I can't read the minds of the proposer and seconders of the Labour motion. I don't know whether they're referring to some of the things that perhaps he might have posted. That they didn't like, but we don't know, and that's the thing. Without you being specific, without the motion being specific about it, it's hard to kind of know what that is. But at the same time, yes, there's a code of conduct, I think, for how councillors conduct themselves in other ways.
Well,
and that's
Yep.
reasonable, and it's reasonable that extends into the digital space. But at what point does that become policing of their right to say things as they like, whether those are things that we don't like or
Well,
agree
we
with?
covered it on the podcast, didn't we? And as George was referenced twice, I think by Simon and by Lee, we know. I think it might have been last year or it was early this year. George was fairly forthright about the robbery in a vape shop and his views on restorative justice. And there were also so I think whilst we say we can't speculate about about whether it was aimed at one person, it feels to me, based on those interventions from the Lib Dem and Conservative councillors, that there might have been a collective feeling that this was principally, well, not even principally and definitely not exclusively, but George's social media presence, which is considerable, and he is often very forthright in his views, as he started to touch on there. So there was I think it was one of those things where I think the majority, or the people who spoke in the chamber, seemed to think this was being pointed at George principally. So I guess we're about to now see George's detailed response to that.
We are indeed. Let me continue back on that clip then.
We have got Charlotte speaking negatively about Councillor Candlish and Councillor Winnington, calling them lazy, that they need hard work. We've also got Charlotte suggesting that the Liberal Party have been very racist indeed. We have Shah saying that residents have committed crimes for speaking their voice. And Tom Coles, which I'm very disappointed in, who you may or may not know is a relative of one of our candidates, Jacob Short. And when Jacob Short lost, somebody said in your group chat, short by name, short on votes. And Tom thought that was hilarious. And Tom responded saying, we found out during the local elections that I'm his second cousin. I can only but apologise. That's disappointing, Tom. That's bullying and not treating people with respect. And I hope you apologise to Jacob for that. There's so many WhatsApp conversations on here where you've referred to Lee Hunt by changing the letter of his surname. You can imagine what that is going to be. Yep, seriously, I've got it here. I can show you, Councillor Hunt. And we have got you providing GDRP regulations where you've disclosed people of Portsmouth's address to 143 of your members. We have got so much stuff. We have got you calling residents. Actually, one of your party members spoke up against you. Okay? One of them spoke up against you and challenged you for the words you were using in relation to the protest, calling people thugs and fascists. And one of your members responded, correct. They're not fascist, they're terrorists. None of you challenged that. Now, the admins in that group are Charlotte Gerarda, the MP Amanda Martin, and Stephen Morgan MP. None of you challenged this kind of conversation. One of your group even suggested that one of the Liberal Democrat members have allegations of sexual assault on a group of 143 people. You've also stated, one of your members also admitted to insulting and screaming at Jacob Shaw and three of his members, which, by the way, are underage, they're children, accusing them of being racist scumbags in the middle of the street and screamed at them, which Jacob was really upset about.
Councillor Gerard.
I appreciate you've brought evidence here today and you're making a claim about something that you've seen. I'm not 100% sure exactly what WhatsApp group you're talking about. Okay, yeah, I'll come and have a look at what you've got there. And obviously, I can't comment on what you're talking about until I've seen the WhatsApp group that you're actually talking about. So I will absolutely come and look at what's there. And obviously, if there's anything that's been said that's untoward or if any action needs to be taken, of course, that's something that we would look into. It goes without saying that there are a lot of WhatsApp groups, and like Councillor Coles, I am not looking at every WhatsApp group that I'm a member of. If I did, I wouldn't get anything done. And as many of you know, I've got a full-time job and a baby, so most of my time is not spent in WhatsApp groups commenting and looking in there. So, okay, well, I'm happy to look through that with you, Councillor Madrick. In terms of what's been raised about limiting freedom of speech and controlling freedom of speech, is absolutely not about that. This is meant to be a policy that goes in two directions. So it's about, protecting councillors when there is abuse. And I thank Councillor Barrett for sharing, obviously, what's happened in relation to her experience and with her son. This is about having clear guidelines in place if we are subject to abuse, but also if there are things that are said online that, as Councillor Hunt made the point, bring the council into disrepute, then obviously that's something that we need to be held to account for. And this is only meant to be a review.
So, and what I'll also cover is, before Charlotte spoke, Tom Coles did take the opportunity to apologise to Jacob Short for the comments that he'd make, and Jacob has accepted that apology. I understand on social media.
Now, this is not pretty, but before we get into this, let me first kind of say that I'm not going to come at this from a holier than thou perspective. How awful that a closed, WhatsApp group has got language in it and, inappropriate jokes and Mickey take and all of that kind of stuff, because that would be hypocritical on my part. I've been rude to people online and I will probably do it again. Sorry, Simon, as an admin, but I guess for me the bit, and this is why I think people have got so, kind of so upset, for want of a better term, this, that it does feel a little bit like we're in that double standards arrangement, references to words hurt. And I guess you can argue that words hurt if you don't know they're going on. But I guess we're in a position where if you're discussing these things privately, mocking people, are you setting a tone in politics?
Well, I think it's an interesting point about probably all of us need to stop and think about what sorts of conversations we have in private groups. And I should imagine the other political parties, after this revelation, suddenly had a cleansing exercise of their private WhatsApp or Facebook groups, because, to be really honest with you, anybody that thinks that actually those are truly private and that no one else that you wouldn't want to see them gets to be able to see them is treading on really, 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 really thin ice, aren't they?
Yep.
Because there isn't really unless you're really particular about checking regularly the contact details of everybody that's in them, and a group with, what was it, 143 people in, or whatever. I think that's next to kind of impossible to do as an administrative task. But from a point of view of, there is a tone that we set, and we shouldn't, and we should challenge when that tone isn't being followed. I guess politics, and we see what it's like in elections. We see what leaflets can be like in elections. We see what social media is like in elections. But it just doesn't help if you're trying to say we should all be treating each other with respect, and we should be being upheld as examples to the community and to the people whose votes that we're trying to gain. If actually what you're also doing is kind of allowing those sorts of things to occur. No, but could I say that those things don't occur in other places too? No, I don't think I could. So I think it's
But isn't it
it's a lesson for everybody about, don't say something in private or on a Facebook group or a WhatsApp group that you don't want to say to someone's face.
Well, and I guess there's an element of, and I think this is where the real kind of issue comes with this one, which is, and somebody put a great phrase on Portsmouth politics, and I about people clutching their pearls in kind of mock indignation. Oh my goodness, won't somebody think of the children? And I think this is where for me there is, I would not stand up in the council chamber and say, hint that people on social media are out of order and they need to be nicer to each other, because, well, the old biblical quote, let he is without sin cast the first stone. I'm not chucking any stones. And I think there is a piece of, if we understand the rules of engagement, that sometimes political discussions will get heated and sometimes we'll say some things to each other that we might not like. And sometimes people will express views online that we don't agree with, then that's all kind of okay. I think the thing for me in this episode is it smacks a little bit of going back to the lockdowns, going back to it did for Boris. These are the rules that you all need to follow. These are the way you should conduct yourself. These are the ways that you should behave. Brackets. Yeah, but none of those rules apply to us in private because we don't think we're going to get caught. We'll do whatever we do. And I think that's what's being called out here. And that's why I think it matters. The actual content, there's nothing in there I've heard thus far that, apart perhaps from, describing protesters as fascists and terrorists, which is thrown about far too often as a moniker. There's nothing in there that truly troubles me. But if you're going to bring a motion before full council saying people really need to behave themselves and choose their language carefully, you probably should make sure that you are sat on top of the moral mountain, shouldn't you?
It makes it easy to point out the hypocrisy. Yes, I agree. And I think that was the bits that I've kind of clipped out for time purposes of George's response. You could hear as he went on, he got progressively kind of angrier and crosser with it, and called on Charlotte as the leader of the Labour group to investigate it and to take the necessary action or suspend, if necessary, the people involved, and to take some responsibility for for the content that's in those groups. But it also goes to show of, if we're going down the lines of holding people accountable for what things are said in groups that they are the admin of, you need to administer that. You can't just be I've set up this group and everyone basically there's no form of moderation. If you're not moderating it, someone else should be, because someone should be challenging stuff that's not right. I'm sure I've been involved in conversations where I've pushed back against things that, is that really what we should be saying? But I'm sure there are also times where I've possibly said things where others have kind of questioned it, and at the end of the day, we should be challenging each other to just do better.
Well, and I guess there's an element of, I don't know whether there are other admins in that group, but I would suggest that Charlotte, as the leader of the local Labour group, and as she said herself, she's in full-time employment. She's got a 1-year-old child, is probably a bit busy. I would hope that Amanda Martin and Stephen Morgan are both a bit busy, being our members of Parliament. So in terms of them trying to moderate a 143-person WhatsApp group, probably they are going to be a bit short of time, and perhaps the wisdom of them policing that is questionable. I think the other thing we've got to recognise in this, Simon, that one of those 143 felt motivated enough to take 500 screenshots and place them in the hands of Pitt.
Yes.
Now, that's either political opportunism or there's something in there was enough stuff in there that made them uncomfortable. So, there's, I guess it's that question, isn't it, in terms of groupthink? Sometimes when, the history is littered with people being in groups where they're not comfortable with what's going on, perhaps aren't brave enough to put their hand up or step forward and say, actually, folks, I don't think this is right. And so they've effectively loaded the gun and handed it to George.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting view. Someone obviously within that group, whatever their original motivations were, has decided to take that action, and that's a lot of screenshotting. If that's 500 screenshots, we've got a comment from Lee saying, "Isn't hypocrisy just another name for politics?" And that's the real shame, is things like this deteriorate people's trust in politics and in politicians, which we all then lose out from.
Well, I think that's I would agree with you in terms of that is a cynical worldview. I think for me, there are, if I look across Portsmouth City Council and the people that we've spoken to on the podcast over 5.5 years, irrespective of their politics, I've found the vast majority of them to have integrity, to have passion, to care about the work that they're doing. There aren't too, I can't think of too many that I've spoken to or we've spoken to on this podcast who I've thought, yeah, they're a slippery fish. They're only in this for themselves. I can think of all the people that I've spoken to from every political party and those that have none. I think the vast majority of councillors for Portsmouth City Council are good people who are trying to do the right thing for their residents, more than themselves. And I just think kind of pantomime like this is unedifying. And I think it's, I think it has been, whether I can't speak for George. I don't know if he had those revelations in his hand. Would he have brought them forward into the council chamber if there hadn't been a motion that was clearly pointing at him? I can't say.
I don't know. Well, we can't read George's mind any more than we can read Charlotte Gerarda's mind. So, at the end of the day, and we did did give an offer to Labour to Charlotte to give a response, and she directed us to the response that she'd given Portsmouth Evening News, which was so this was quoted in the Portsmouth Evening News article from Toby Payne in the Week. Where a Labour spokesperson was quoted as saying, Portsmouth Labour are relentlessly focused on delivering value for money for council taxpayers and building the best possible city for everyone in Portsmouth. The electorate is far more interested in delivery and turning the country around than trivia.
And a fascinating response in of itself, which appears to be nothing to see here. So having raised the issue of conduct of councillors and the way in which they use words and they speak about each other or they speak in the public domain, I find the word trivia all rather disparaging in the end. So if it doesn't matter, why did you bring it up?
Indeed. Well, that's a conundrum we're not going to solve today. Let's move on to item B.
No.
Which was
let's
tackling the crisis in temporary accommodations. We've got a clip in a second. This is a motion from the Lib Dems. There was a Labour amendment from Charlotte Gerarda and Graham Heaney seeking to broadly shift the narrative away from calling on the city's two MPs and government but to instead to instruct the leader to contact a relevant minister about Portsmouth City Council overspends ahead of fiscal events, i.e. the budget, and work with city MPs and Cabinet Housing to ask the University of Portsmouth if they have any accommodation spare. So let's listen to those clips on that one, and we'll have a brief discussion on that one after that one.
Councillor Sanders.
The Lib Dem policy of buying back right to buy properties, restarting the building of council homes, and a focus on preventing homelessness has helped keep this wolf from our door. Until now. When I heard a few weeks ago that we could not do that any longer, numbers up 54%, costs up 84%, we had to be honest and act. That's why the housing team offered briefings to councillors, the media, and our local MPs. And I want to thank everyone who attended, especially Amanda Martin MP, who offered to raise our concerns with government. We're very grateful. And with a reminder that this is not about those who sleep rough, because the law says that those people are not priority homeless. This is not to do with people seeking asylum. Those who believe otherwise are wrong. Now, I'm told that some people may see this motion as a cheap political point against the new government. I disagree, because the main reason every council in this country is facing this crisis is that every single person in temporary accommodation gets housing benefit. That's local housing allowance in the jargon. But they get it at the level it was in 2011. This council pays out more than 5 times in rent on temporary accommodation than it gets back in housing benefit. And this city's council taxpayers foot the bill.
Councillor Girardi.
It's ironic that the Labour government has been in power for just 4 months and the Lib Dem administration expects that Labour should solve 14 years of Tory government failure in one budget, and when the country's finances are in a dire state. And those austerity measures wouldn't have even existed if it wasn't for the Tory Lib Dem coalition in the first place. And I know I'm going to get some silence and eye rolls, but it's a really important point to make, and I have to make it. The second amendment is in relation to the statement that the government should take up measures to tackle homelessness, recommended by 100 council leaders. But this refers to a letter that was sent last year to a completely different government. I want to know, when the Labour government was elected this July, did the leader send the letter again? Because our 2 cities MPs haven't had sight of that letter, and it's ridiculous to expect a newly elected Labour government to take action on a letter that came a year before they were in power. But by bringing this motion now, after the autumn budget, the administration knows full well that this is not possible, which makes this motion nothing more than a media stunt. We've spoken with the city MPs, and prior to last week, they hadn't been directly contacted by the leader of this council about the crisis in Portsmouth's temporary accommodation. The leader knows, and every councillor in this chamber knows, that if you want to secure funds from government, you influence ahead of government fiscal events.
Councillor Pitt.
I wrote to the Deputy Prime Minister after the general election, and the letter was copied to local MPs, I believe. Could the Chief Executive confirm? Thank you, Natalie. Informing them of the issues. The Local Government Association published a white paper which was comprised, by the way, for anyone watching today, by all parties, focusing on the key issues facing councils up and down this country. And they are the pressures being caused by adults and children's social care, temporary accommodation costs. So these are not new things that the Labour government was hid in a cupboard with noise-cancelling headphones on when they were in opposition and didn't understand what was going on in the UK. What the LGA conference, cross-party LGA conference, was completely obsessed with this year in October were, unsurprisingly, the costs of children's social services, the cost of adult social services, and the cost of temporary accommodation across the country for hundreds of local authorities, many of whom are now faced in year with having to consider filing a Section 114 notice. So it's all smoke and mirrors, and I'm sure we're all supposed to run around saying how wonderful both of our Labour MPs are, but you're in government now, Councillor Girardi. So £233 million from Labour next year will not stop local authorities up and down this country from facing insolvency this year. In fact, you don't have to look very far, because Southampton-led Labour is on the verge of a 114, having already sought out a bailout from government last year, and Hampshire County Council is also on the verge of collapse, issuing notices to staff and having to deal with a £170 million budget problem. Now, I refer you directly to a letter from Angela Rayner to chief executives and council leaders received today, which says that the money allocated, that £233 million, is to help prevent rises in the number of families in TA and to help prevent homelessness. It is not to reduce the current pressure that we all have. So the TA cost estimated to local authorities 22-23 was 1.7 billion. By 23-24, it was 2.29 billion. Many have seen their costs double, triple or worse. Not my words. The Local Government Association's words. The increase in households in TA over the last 10 years has been 89%, 104,000 of them by March last year. These aren't secrets, Lord Mayor. You can look it up on the internet, councillors. Successive governments, including our own involvement in the coalition, have not tackled this problem effectively. You're in government now, not opposition. It's time to face the music.
Council Leader Steve Pitt not really pulling his punches there.
I think he got the message across. It's well, I guess, you know, there is this, as I say, the full moon was up, and emotions running pretty high, weren't they?
They were indeed, and remember, this was before the revelation from George Madrick. So the mood of the meeting didn't get much better. I don't think there's a lot we can probably add to that than has already been done. So
no, I think to be honest, the fact is that, you know, and this is one of those things, isn't it, where costs are rising, and there has been inflationary costs, and people seem to think, oh well, you know, it's down to 2%. Yeah, but it's 2% more after it grew by 10% the year before. So it's still getting bigger. It's just not getting bigger as quick.
Yes, it's getting bigger more slowly. It's not getting smaller. Yeah.
And it's that thing where, you know, and everyone wants more money. And, you know, the rise to the minimum wage, everyone's applauded it. It's going up by, you know, nearly 7% next year. It went up by over 10% this year. But the minimum wage now is for somebody working 37 hours a week is £23,500. It's only 3 years ago that it was £18,500, £19,000. Well, but that means that the person who was the supervisor of the £18,000 person before on 21,000 now wants 2 or 3 grand more than 23.5. And, you know, all the time that happens, you know, it's that piece where, well, somebody's got to pay for that. And when you look at temporary accommodation generally, you know, it is £1,000, you know, it's a minimum of £1,000 for a 1-bed flat in Portsmouth. So, you know, temporary accommodation knows what the market is and are going to ramp their prices up accordingly. So, yeah, quite an exchange there.
Indeed. I'll move on to D, which was the motion that came immediately after the social media policy. So excuse the confusion to everybody if we're kind of dashing backwards and jumping about a bit. But the increase in single capped bus fare, this was a motion from the Lib Dems, so from Peter Candlish and Lee Hunt, and they were talking about Portsmouth won a £48 million grant for the basically to improve bus transit and to grow bus patronage in Portsmouth. Ridership's actually recovered from COVID lows faster in this city than in any other city. There were 12 million bus trips last year. It's up 20% year on year. All good news. But the £20 cap has been the £2 cap has been a fundamental to that growth, and the government has announced that this will increase to £3 in 2025. In his opening statement, Councillor Candlish, said that the increase is a backward step that will hurt lower paid students, and he mentioned about pensioners. The worst for an office worker, this equates to 1% on income tax. The increase will not be felt in Labour-controlled Manchester or London, where they've actually retained the £2 cap. But he also mentioned about this on the back of other decisions about not removing the 2-child benefit cap and removing winter fuel allowance, except for those on pension credit. Graham Heaney from the Labour Party remarked on, well, is this going to be a theme, basically, that every full council we're just going to have motions criticising the Labour government, and will the Lib Dems have the gall to bring forward a motion criticising what the Labour Party have just done about tuition fees? Talked about we can't do everything that's necessary. Price isn't the only thing. There's no point having a cheap bus service if you actually need a bus at 7:30 and there isn't one. So it doesn't matter what fare it is. And his amendment was calling for calling for an impact assessment on the increase. And Lee Hunt got quite impatient, saying that no, the amendment shouldn't be accepted, and he had enough basically of them today and went a bit off topic with trying to draw it back to the conversation. So there was a bit of a scrabble between him and the Lord Mayor at that point. Brian Madrick, Councillor Madrick Senior, talked about Sunak warning ahead of the election about Labour tax increases and putting up taxes in disguise after lying your way into office. Judy Smythe, who sits as an independent, talked about it. It's just a cap. It doesn't have to be as much as that, and pointed out that pensioners won't be affected by this because they get a bus pass and therefore they're exempt. Darren Sanders of the Lib Dems talked about where are the green pledges from Labour's manifesto. You've frozen fuel duty but increased bus fares. You make choices in governments. Private equity companies have been allowed to keep £245 million tax break on carried interest, which in your manifesto said would be taxed in line with earnings. And there was a bit of a spat between Matthew Winnington, who went on about tuition fees and the origins of those, and Councillor Smythe again tried to defend the motion, and the Lord Mayor pointed out that Councillor Smythe, it's not the amendment, Councillor Smythe isn't sitting in the Labour group, so it isn't her amendment to defend. So you could kind of tell the bad blood, for want of a better feeling, in that exchange, and the lack of patience, really.
Bad moon rising, Simon.
It is indeed. It is indeed. So,
and it is a tricky one, because the fact is that Labour are now in government. We touched on it when we did our budget special. I was incredulous about we're going to save motorists 7p a litre on fuel, which nobody would notice anyway because fuel goes up and down. But if you're somebody who can't afford a car and is reliant on public transport, potentially if your bus fare goes up £2 a day, you got to find another £10 a week. Well, I my thoughts on buses are well publicised, but for God's sake, tax me as somebody who puts petrol in my car, and give the bloody money to the bus people. I'm sounding like a socialist now, but it does all seem. It seems to me that by that stage, it looks like everyone had got pretty fraught, and there was an element of, are we going to bring forward motions criticising the Labour government every month? Well, forgive me, but we've covered this in detail for 3 years. I think I remember most council meetings there being this council chamber calls on the Tory government for smelling of wee and generally being a bit rubbish.
So I think there's a wider point. There is one more motion quickly to cover in passing, but before we kind of wrap up. But there is a wider thing to cover about some other councils have rules that say that the council can only discuss motions that are actually within the council's power.
Oh, we've got to adopt that.
And that isn't, and instructing the council to write a letter to someone isn't.
Can we make a
considered
deputation?
A power enough? So that might be worth kind of looking at, and maybe we can get full council meetings down to about half an hour. But it's
can we as residents?
Well, we're residents of the city. We can make a deputation.
We're going to do that in the new year.
Are we?
We are.
Okay.
We are. I'm going to go to full council and make exactly that deputation. That's happening.
So you don't want us to get any guests?
No, I don't think. I'll be honest with you. I think it's one of those things which would receive support.
It might well actually receive universal acclaim. We've got a couple of comments. Tim, forgive me, I can't quote your comments because of some of the language in one of them. I don't know whether that was intended or just a slip of the keyboard. But he talks about basically he points out some contradicting decisions made by and points made both by Graham Heaney and Councillor Candlish. So great points, and he's talking about bus fares and about the ferry fare rates. And Lee makes another point about fare increases just makes it more attractive to use a taxi if more than one person is travelling, and therefore adding to traffic. So again, we're going to bounce on from that one. So great points. Thank you very much, both. So the next one to discuss was the thing about nominations for alderman, for honorary alderman. So to put that into English, because as was said in the meeting, most people probably don't actually know what one is. There is a process by which long-serving councillors, when they cease to be a councillor, become an honorary alderman. Not quite sure what powers that bestows on them, but it's a lifelong honorary where basically they have this title. They don't get money, they don't get kind of power or anything, but essentially it's a reflection of their commitment to the council and their service to the city. There's a motion from the Labour group, from Councillor Heaney, from Labour and PIP, so from Councillor Heaney and from George Madgwick, basically calling for a review on this process and asking that is actually looked at. And I'll summarise some of the remarks, but then I'll play a closing comment from Steve Pitt because I think it might summarise some of the feeling. So Council Leader Steve Pitt remarked, this is the third motion today that just is something that needs to go to GASC, which is the Governance Audit and Standards Committee. Lee Hunt remarked, calling it basically a waste of officers' time. Simon Bosher, the leader of the Conservative group, said that he's worried that he's yet again agreeing with Lee Hunt. The alderman is about service to community, not personal vendettas or positions. And Leo Madden, who was a recently considered nomination for alderman, and Graham Heaney's point was that, and in his opening statement, he mentioned that he wasn't really going to mention his reasons for not wanting to support that nomination, but he didn't feel there was a solid enough process, a formal enough process for that to happen. And what seems to happen is that someone brings a nomination, the group leaders of the different groups of the council discuss it, supposedly having discussed it with their respective members to raise any issues, and if that's still an issue, the nomination doesn't go forward. That seems to be the nuts and bolts of the current process. But Simon Bosher remarked that Leo Madden has served his voters for 30 years and they kept re-electing him, so they obviously didn't have a problem with him. But George Madgwick pointed out that Portsmouth Independence Party, they don't have the same history as the established parties do. And he's relying on other people to tell him things about a particular person that's being nominated. And actually what would be useful would be to have a basic rundown on that person, their length of service, their notable achievements, what committees they were on, etc. I mean, that seems eminently sensible, right? To have some sort of bio of them when they're being considered, right?
This is...
and that the process needs improving. But the closing remarks from Steve Pitt, I think, might just kind of set a tone on it. Let me just play that.
I'm not sure that having a different process will get a different outcome. Now, therefore, we seem to be looking at an awful lot of stuff that's about process and about governance, and then we've seen a more and more process this afternoon. And I'd like to contrast that with what we've done as the Liberal Democrat administration this afternoon, where we've asked people to consider the impact on working people of raising the bus cap. And we've talked about the housing crisis in the city. So my view of this notice of motion, which I'm happy to amend in the way that I've proposed, is that this council and the councillors on it need to be devoting all of their energies to supporting local people, Councillor Heaney, and not worried about whether or not a cross-party committee of councillors are going to spend a vast amount of time reviewing something that's actually worked absolutely fine for a very long time. We need to be realistic about what this council is devoting its time and energy to. And I do think that looking after vulnerable people and worrying about children with SEND and families who are stuck in temporary accommodation and the huge amount of pressure on the council around children's and adult social care, etc., etc., I could go on for a very long time, I'm not going to, is more important and demands much more of my time as leader of the council than this. So I'm very happy to send it off to scrutiny where it belongs so that it doesn't occupy another minute of my time.
I think you didn't need to read between the lines.
Steve Pitt, usually very poker play. You don't know what Steve thinks. That's not true. So, you know...
Yeah, he's always on the fence,
always
that
on
guy.
the fence.
You can never tell what he's really thinking.
And at the end of the day, look, let's look at all of this in the round, which is that, you know, we elect people to speak for us. And as I said, I don't agree about, you know, all politics being all about duality or cynicism or anything else. I think people are passionate, they care. Yes, sometimes we all get frustrated by what goes on, and we will look at, I will personally look at how, if there is anything that as a humble resident of Caution we can do to take a lot of the nonsense out of these council meetings, because yes, Steve there, even at the end, well, we are, and yes, these are real issues, but they won't be solved in that chamber. So I think, I have a sneaking suspicion that Full Moon Tuesday, as it will come to be known, I'm not sure that's going to be the end of it. Whether there's bauble hats and whether they have Secret Santa at the next meeting in December, I'm not sure all of the wounds are going to be healed by then.
Yeah, I don't know whether the Christmas spirit would have broken out, because the other thing is, this is without us even having any elections in the city next year.
Yeah, and we touched.
If this is how tense it is now without there being any elections in May.
Yeah, it's a long run into May 26, isn't it?
We've got the budget to come up. So the last thing that I did want to cover was the question of, there were 16 questions from members on the order paper last month. I think we got through 9 of them. The rest of them actually received written responses. The links to that are actually already on our website if anybody wanted to go and have a look at them. This time, do you want to guess how many there were?
I know the answer.
Oh, okay. Well, it was 1. There was 1 question.
Well, and I guess probably by the end of it, everyone had probably had enough, as they might have done, as we have subtly overrun. But well, what a session that was, and we crammed it 5 hours into just over the hour. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Join us next week at 6:27, where we will be hearing from some of Portsmouth's producers, not the movie kind, the ones that actually make stuff. So it'll be lovely to hear from them. So see you next week at 6:27. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.